Up today. I want to start with Squash's game. I think Squash is going to be our number one up. I was just kind of working on the order here, but I think that's probably the best way to do it. I was just looking. Electric Horse, thank you very much for the stream. I just wanted to start off. We have 5 games and we have 1 theory practice today, is what I had in mind. But yeah, I welcome you all being here. Thank you very much for being here, and yeah, let's get things started. Squash is playing white in this game. He plays the London system. I highly recommend the London system. I think it's a great way to play. Basically, the London system involves a lot of, basically it's a very solid opening. Objectively speaking, probably one of the best. When they do computer analysis, when they do, in the high-level world champion matches, I'd strongly recommend, they strongly recommend lean towards London system as a generally good opening. So yeah, I like it a lot. I mean, I don't play it because I'm not a D4 player, but I think, in most situations you want to go with what's objectively the best, and I think that the London system offers a lot of opportunities for white. Just very solid. Nothing crazy, no crazy traps or complicated situations. But just generally good and leads to solid play for white out of most positions. There's a few different ways to play it. This looks like a pretty early f6. I'm just looking in terms of commonness of openings that are being played. f6 doesn't even appear on the list. Basically here, black is playing for an early f6 e5. That's challenging. Hey Pravilo, I just wanted to tell you, Pravilo, I reviewed your game last night in one of the later slots. I was planning to do it today, but you got an early analysis. The game that you sent, we took a look at last night during last night's stream. I hope that's all right. We got to it early, but yeah, just wanted to make sure you knew that, Privilo. There's a combination of moves that I think black is basically doing that are a bit unusual here. Knight c6 paired with f6 does have some opening theory involved in it. Basically this isn't like it's something that's never been played before, but f6 and knight to c6. Yeah, no, sorry about that. I meant to I meant to do it tonight, but I flipped a little bit of the schedule around, so it got to it last night. But yeah, so e3, g5, and basically, black is aggressively expanding. I don't know how sound this is. I don't know how good an idea this is for white. Knight takes makes sense to me as a move. I think I don't know if it tactically plays out, but black's going to be under a lot of pressure with this early g5 having been played. With queen h5, king is forced to d7, right? And now basically, how do you assess this position? Yeah, the London system is boring. It's true. It's definitely very, the thing about the London system is it's very solid. Boring, dull play, objectively very strong. But yeah, it definitely offers fewer opportunities. I mean, there's a reason why I play e4 and not d4. I think, engine analysis is basically leaning on the idea that the London system is objectively one of, if not the strongest opening. But I play e4. And I do that knowing that London system is probably objectively one of the best openings. You do need to find openings that are fun for you. But at the same time, anyone playing the London system who enjoys that kind of positional solid play, that always makes sense to me, because I'm like, all right, well, you probably do want to, at the end of the day, you do probably want to go with the thing that's objectively the best. But yeah, good point, Pravilo. It is boring. It is slow. And I think basically, when you're looking at something like that, you need to, you need to come up with an opening theory that fits the way that you would like to play chess. But at the same time, engines are pointing at, and I have to agree, like, engines point towards 2 things. They point towards basically d4 being better than e4. That's pretty objectively shown. If you look at some of the AlphaZero, some of the Google engine analysis, they really are pushing towards d4 as opposed to e4. Very few engines consider e4. Yeah, no, that's completely understandable, Pravilo. And you got to find a way to play chess that makes the most sense to you. I agree. I agree with your thought, Pravilo. But the engine analysis, just as a big picture thing, points heavily towards d4 over e4, And I, as an e4 player, I'm like, well, what do I do with that? Like, that's kind of rough. But it really does indicate that d4 is better than e4 at this point. And basically that and basically that the London system is one of the strongest, if not the strongest, line out of d4. I guess these things do change over time. It's possible that there will be engines that find excellent transpositions out of E4 at some point, but that's not what I think is going to happen. I think basically, as chess gets closer and closer to being solved, the value of D4 is going to become higher than the value of E4, which is interesting. I mean, it's still much more fun for me personally to play E4, but I'm not one to doubt the sophistication of the engines. I mean, they really are just, if something is better than all the people and it's pointing towards a direction, it's probably correct. So anyways, with that said, you can win many games with e4. You can win many games with gambits. I wouldn't discourage you if that's the way that you want to play. But if the goal is coming up with objectively the best games, then I would say that d4 is probably the correct route to do that. That's just the big picture overview of d4 versus e4. I would look at some of the analysis done by Google AlphaZero. Google AlphaZero does some very interesting things related to opening theory. There's some big statistical breakdowns of how the computers are playing, and at the end of the day, I mean, until we can comfortably beat computers, I would say that their judgment is correct. Hey, good morning, Kiro. How are you? But yeah, so this is the London system, and I guess I wouldn't say that anyone should play the London system if they enjoy playing something else more. But I can't come up with any criticism of people who enjoy playing the London system, because the London system, I think, does point towards this being the best opening, or the engines do point to the London system being one of the best openings. Anyways, it is boring. Thank you. I sort of agree. It's less fun for me to play than e4. That's why I still play e4. But yeah, I think this one, at least at the very highest level, I think it's objectively better. Anyways, f6 and knight c6 are kind of an interesting system to be playing against the London. e5 is getting heavily pushed towards. I don't know if knight c6 is the correct placement for the knight. I would be kind of curious if maybe knight d7 is the correct placement of the knight. But in any case, e5 is putting pressure. Basically, e5 is going to become a very playable move for black here. e3, g5, knight takes, bishop takes. This is a very aggressive response to it. I don't know if white needs a response that's this aggressive. I guess I would say probably. I don't know. G5 is a move that will allow knight to 8. That will probably allow some threats along the h5, e8 diagonal, but I would try to finesse it a little bit more. Black's playing really aggressively, basically sacrificing the knight for 2 pawns here. And objectively speaking, black ends up on the better side of this. I mean, the piece is worth more than 2 pawns for sure, and the king actually seems to be able to manage to find some king safety over there. So overall, I like the general concept. Definitely think that that g5 poses the ability to create some aggression on the h5 e8 diagonal. But I would probably just play bishop g3. Let bishop g3. Black probably plays h5, and then you play h4, and that diagonal closes a little bit. You might be able to play things along the e8 g6 diagonal. That could potentially be a thing. But generally, I think white's just without trading off the bishop or the piece that way. White's just in a comfortable position. Black's basically overextended here. The engine suggesting h5. Here I would play h4 probably. Engine suggesting h3. I'd still probably play h4. H4 and allow g4. H3 contests g4 a little bit more, but I don't know. I guess I sort of like the pressure that h4 exerts on the g5 pawn. This makes more of a dispute over the g4 square. Anyways, this game's going on solidly, and in terms of ways that this could advance, queen h5 makes sense, forking the king and pawn, 2 pawns, and now basically white's got an interesting challenge. He sacrificed the knight. The king is in an awkward square. His development, White's development, is not that much better. Definitely not enough to justify trading the knight for 2 pawns. But he has practical compensation. I mean, having your king on d7 makes the position more difficult to play. My ideas here would be something like knight c3. Probably White wants to get developed as quickly as possible. Things like potentially bishop to e5 on e6 could be good. It's just generally sort of tricky. I would play some moves with... I would play developing moves here as White. But I do think that this sort of points towards the fact that that knight sacrifice was unsound, even though, you know, it puts the black king in an awkward position. Knight e5 could become a good outpost, or e5 could become a good outpost for a knight or a bishop. So White may want to exploit that later in an attack, but this is sort of tricky. g3, bishop h3, I think that's an idea. I don't dislike that. I think maybe bishop to d3 might have been a more efficient way to push this bishop onto that diagonal. Like bishop d3, bishop f5 maybe. I'd have to think about that some more. Or bishop e2 potentially. I like the bishop coming in on the h3, c8 diagonal, but I don't know if g3 is the way to do it. g3 limits the mobility of this bishop, and overall I think may cause White some developmental issues. Anyways, I like the idea of getting more force in the game, so that makes sense. This hangs a piece, and I think after this I have to assume White's in pretty serious trouble. Yeah, it stays at about -7 for the rest of the game. Although White is doing what he can to play this endgame out, but I think this is going to lead to a win for Black. Yep. Okay, cool. So this gives us a really good place to kind of focus and look at Squash's game. Thank you very much for sending the game, by the way. Squash is always super helpful. I like the general idea of this attack. I like the idea. I think in terms of execution, I don't quite think you can get away with sacking the knight for the 2 pawns here. It was a really cool try, and I really like the way that you seized on this vulnerable diagonal, this h5, e8 diagonal for Black. I like that a lot. I think that there are other ways to do it that probably are more optimal. I think the idea, the idea is good. Come up with what you can to break in on that diagonal. But I would still probably play bishop to g3. It's a great idea, but the sacrifice, I think, is just more material than White can comfortably give away. This is the line that I like more. Here, even from here, you still have this g6, e8 diagonal available, and at least now the material is equal. So you can play like knight fd2, c4, knight c3, and really open up this position with Black having a vulnerable king. When you sacrifice the piece that completely, you're very, very committed to that attack. Not saying that that's always wrong, but it just means that this really better work. And in this particular case, I don't think you have enough pieces to quite make it work. So I really like the idea. I think, maybe ideas like bishop to d3, bishop to g3 first as the practical first move. But then something like bishop to d3, focusing on the d3, h7 diagonal. I think that might be a better way to go about this. I like the check, but the check is not a checkmate, so sacking a piece really means that the rest of the attack has to do something to get you back the piece. And I think when it just comes down to this queen and this bishop on the king side and attacking, which is great, I just don't think it's enough pieces over there. Bishop h3 is cool, and all this I think is just makes sense. It's the best that White can do out of this, but I think the fundamental concept is just a little bit too aggressive, unfortunately. I think ideas like bishop g3 followed by h4 followed by knight d2 on g4, I think that general plan is going to work out a little bit better for White. Overall, I like the idea. I can't fault the idea at all. I think it's the correct idea. Exploiting that diagonal is definitely a good idea, but here I would say, you just don't quite get enough. The follow-up on this attack just isn't enough to justify it. You sacrificed a knight, and sacrificing a piece is a lot of material. Basically sacrificing a piece means that you have to win back at least a piece or mate to justify it, or 4 pawns or whatever. But a lot of material has to be won in response to a sacrificed piece. Overall, I like it. I think you did I think you came up with a good plan, but I think that the game really, skews very quickly in Black's direction with this early piece sacrifice. I like it. It's a bummer because it's frustrating when you like the idea, but you don't quite have the tactical, it just doesn't have the tactical execution behind it. But I think that's what happened here. Queen h6 7 is an error that kind of puts this game away, unfortunately, but it's overall overall a reasonable, basically a reasonable best shot, but the initial sacrifice was unsound. Thank you very much for sending the game, Squash. I encourage you to play more moves and games like that. It was a good game, good ideas, and I really appreciate you sending it. Just a little bit too aggressive. I like the idea, just a little bit too aggressive is the main point. Okay, cool. So we're gonna take this position. This is Fuchubio's game, playing black against playing black here. He plays against e3. E3 is a weird and unchallenging way for white to start a game. You want to take center control. So I think basically e3 provides. Let's just see. E3 basically puts this this dial, which normally should be at about 0.3, 0.35 for white initiative. Knight takes g5. Yeah, it was really a good try. I mean, to be honest, I like the general attack. I like the thinking there, but it's just tough when there's not really. It's basically it's tough. What can you do with a full piece versus two pawns? I like the idea. There's many places where those sacrifices can really be brilliancies, but this one there just weren't enough pieces to support it. And it's good to do some analysis on those types of piece sacrifices, because they give you a sense of when is an attack enough compensation for a big sacrifice. In that particular case, there just wasn't, but it was still a good idea, and I like the thinking there. Anyways, e3, e5, bishop c4, knight c3. Black's already looking better. e3 doesn't challenge the center, whereas black's moves d5 and e5 definitely do. Black has the better center. Black has equal development. Overall, I like black's position. Queen f3 is interesting. This puts a lot of pressure on black. It defends the d5 square, among other things. I think here you can do like d6, bishop e6 might be a good solution. It's a little bit tricky because, d6 closes off the good bishop very early in this opening. But I think your chances of playing d5 later are still pretty high. So in general, I guess I would say that that's fine. The engine is suggesting knight to b4. White doesn't really have such an awesome response to knight b4. It's bishop to b3, and here you can play d5, and basically this bishop is pinned. Right? I mean, it's pinned to the defense of the c2 square. So d5 is actually a pretty good move in this case. This is the engine's plan, not mine. My plan was just to play d6 and bishop e6. But the engine comes up with a precise tactic here, which is knight to b4, threatening the c2 pawn. Bishop has to move to b3. I mean, nothing else is nearly as good. And on bishop to b3, you can then play d5 because the bishop can't get comfortably drawn away from the b3 square. Something like knight takes, and the natural piece to take would be the bishop, but the bishop can't move because then knight takes c2 instead. So yeah, engine idea, but a pretty strong one. I'd play d6 and bishop e6 here. Knight takes, cool. D takes. And overall here, I think black just has a better center. White never really made the moves that it requires to, to challenge the center. Basically, in many ways, e3 sort of has some similarities to flank openings like g3 and b3, but they don't have the advantage of the fianchettoed bishop. So they just end up with white being, equalized almost instantly. Overall here, black has a better center. This looks really good. Good ideas. Bishop e6 can be played next move. Queen f6 can be played next move. And black's development is better than white's here. This bishop is not good. Black's bishop is actually a lot stronger. The knight doesn't have natural squares. It probably ends up going to g3, but even that's sort of awkward. White basically, in this position, I would say white basically needs a center pawn push. d4 is the way that I would do it probably. D4 looks pretty well supported. Black probably would play E4 as opposed to taking. On D4, pawn takes. This actually is good for white. I think this is a good transposition for white. Fixes his bishop's development. But overall here, I think basically black has the better chances, better game. White just didn't, from a strategic perspective, white just never put any pressure on black. E3 is not a challenging opening for black to play against, to be honest. Queen f6 threatens f2. And yeah, good plan. Basically, black is doing, I don't know how accurate this is, but black is making pushes to advance his pawn structure on, here, by the, I think I would play I don't know, I might play f4 here. But then black, with his pieces basically all reasonably well developed, plays a move like c5 or b5 and then c5. And this, I think, is a pretty good plan. This means that either way, the king is going to be trouble after castling. This centralized pawn structure for black is good, I think. This looks pretty solid. Bishop's threatening g2, which is a good plan. And black has better center control, both in the small center and in the larger scope of the center. It looks good to me. And then castling is uncomfortable. Queen's Indian game. Good question. Good question. Good question, Tarash. I think that's on it's a good question, Tarash. Let me figure out exactly. So on the 7th, we looked at the English, and that was your slot. I don't think we looked at that yet, Tarash. I think basically we looked at the Grunfeld last night, and then so we started off with some opening theory in the Grunfeld. It was a little bit superficial, to be completely honest, but it was a good demonstration of the Grunfeld and some anti-Grunfeld lines. And then I don't see a Queen's Indian for you. I can add one, but I don't see Queen's Indian for Tarash on my list, unfortunately. But I can add it. You want me to add it? Yeah, not on my list, unfortunately. But yeah, so anyways, sent you a game in. Okay, let me figure this out, Tarash. Were you playing in it, or was it different players? Let's take a look at the schedule, just so I know. Do you have access to the Discord with the schedule on it, Tarash? Oh, anonymous, right. Okay. I don't see it on the schedule, to be honest. I'm just looking at the upcoming schedule. I have the schedule for the 9th, right? In the Discord, and the 9th has the Vienna Gambit, Squashes game, and the ones that I'm going over now. And then I don't see your game on here, Tarash. So it's not on for the 9th. I can put it on the schedule for a later point, though. Anyways, let's keep going on this. So ideas here. Okay, cool. Yeah, so here, basically black makes early challenges for the queen side. C5, castles queen side, b4. I think b4 is a good idea. The engine doesn't really like it, doesn't think that this is the soundest idea. But overall, these squares provide a lot of compensation for black. I think ideas like rook b8, rook b6, challenging the queen on a6. I think basically this is this is good. Other ideas, b4 is a way to break in, c4 is a way to break in, but I think that the engine is implying, and I basically agree that it's a little bit early. The only piece not really involved in, the only pieces not really involved in black's attack on the queen side here, this post-castling attack, are the rooks. I think one of them should improve to b8, probably the f rook. The a rook at least supports the a pawn, so has a small piece in this. But rook f8 should play to b8 and then should play to b6. And the queen is I think getting threatened on a5, or basically going to be threatened on a6, and we'll have to move to like a5. Basically, I think this is the best move. You can first thing, it supports this b pawn, so on b4 it'll be well supported pawn break. And then on the queen side, basically, rook b6 is going to push this queen to somewhere uncomfortable, basically attacking the queen. I don't know whether you follow that up with bishop e7 with the discovered defense of the rook by the queen, but definitely, you know, I think you're focused on the right things here. You definitely want to start an attack, but b4 I think is a little bit quick. You know, I think rook b8 followed by rook b6 is the way to do this. That's what I would recommend. But b4, c4, bishop takes, rook g1, bishop f3, rook e1. Your game is coming. Yes, your game is coming next, Electric Horse. We can make it after 11:15. Sure. Yeah, that works. I've never got any problems with reordering them. I got to think about it a little bit, because I think people do sort of plan their schedules around when things appear. But I guess I can do that. Sure, Electric Horse. We can do that. Yeah. So ideas here. Bishop f4 is a tactical move. Okay, cool, awesome. All right, good to hear. Good to hear, Tarash. It's on May 10th for 6:05. Okay, yeah, and I see the Lee Chess link. If there's ever any questions, we can always check the video on demand. I mess the schedule up sometimes too, for sure. Like, I definitely mess the schedule up sometimes. So I always want to, you know, double check. And I think what I'm going to do is I'm just going to publish the schedule every single day, and hopefully do it right. And publish every day going forward. So there's so it's super clear when everyone's game is. But yeah. No, thanks, Tarash. It is May 10th at 6:05. Yeah, my fault. Okay. Here, I think basically black's better. He should be able to queen one of these pawns, and okay, sure. Bishop takes c5 and bishop f4 better. Let's go back to the beginning. Interesting. Right. Yeah, I see what you're saying. A good tactical find, Fachubio. Yeah, good point. Bishop takes c5, discovery on the queen, and then bishop takes e3 with check. Yeah, that looks good. What Fachubio is saying here is bishop takes c5 is better than bishop f4. Yeah, I agree with that. You know, queen takes, bishop takes with check. I mean, they're still calling it a blunder, but oh well, it hangs the e7 pawn, right, or the e7 bishop, right? Yeah. So I think. Interesting. So I guess I would say maybe. I mean, the engine is suggesting bishop takes h2, but this is tricky though, because you need to defend the e7 bishop, right? Oh, okay. The bishop e7. Yeah, so saving it might not be possible. I see what you're saying. Yep, good point. Good point, Fachubio, for sure. I'm wondering how to improve this though. It may not be possible. I like bishop. Yeah, bishop takes h2, right? At least then on the recapture you've got threats. I think you're still going to lose one of the bishops back though. Rook plays to h1, and then both of the bishops are getting threatened at the same time. But here you can play. Then you play bishop takes c4 and bishop takes a2 on the recapture. So tactical stuff going on here in the big picture. Yeah, I like the ideas. I mean, that's just an idea. That's just an idea, Fuchubio. But I'm just looking at this because I definitely do want. I want to slow this down for a minute because I just want to look at this attack on the queen side here. Maybe b4 is the way to do it. B4 is what was played in the game. I think rook f b8 is probably an improvement. Rook f b8 with ideas of c5 and rook, and then rook b6. It's interesting though. Bishop takes g2 is hanging, by the way, in this situation. But I'm not sure if that's worth it. I might just play rook b8. I like f rook b8. Yeah, supports the b5 pawn. Also, rook b6 can be played. Overall, here I think this is pretty good for black. I'd play rook f b8. I don't think it's bad though. I don't dislike c5. I mean, the response that the engine's giving is knight g3. I do think moving things forward here is helpful. This improves your bishop and it prevents queen b7. It makes sense to me in the bigger picture, at least. Bishop takes g2 is what's getting advocated by the engine here. I think c5 is not terrible. At least the ideas behind c5 make sense to me, like rook b8, rook b6, and then maybe bishop e7. So c5 is another one where the engine doesn't really like it, but I don't know. I'm just thinking more from a conceptual terms as opposed to tactical terms here. But yeah, the move that I'm liking less is b4, but c5, yeah. But I do think the attack is good. I like that. I like the attack. Oh right, it hung the b5 pawn. But not really, because you can play rook b8 against it though. So queen takes b5, rook b8, and then at least this retake on b2. Right? Yeah, for sure. Let's think about. I mean, I don't know if white has the pieces to attack, but it definitely makes things more difficult on the g7 square and the defense of the king side to open the file. Yeah, it's kind of a weird pawn for black to take though. This is annoying. Don't get me wrong. This is tricky, but I think ideas like I think basically bishop to f3 and pressure on the king side here is yeah, it's definitely something. Rook b8, rook b6 maybe. This is where I would take this opening, but it's, I don't know, tactically complicated. And then yeah, you pointed out the value of moves other than bishop f4 here. Bishop takes h2 is the main improvement. Bishop takes h2 and then queen takes h6. Rook takes h6 leads you to get all these pawns in return for the bishop. So you get this one and you get the c4 one. That's a little bit better tactically. And then it goes into a rook and pawn endgame that's generally good for black. So this seemed to work out pretty well. I want to go through the pieces that I think you know, might be helpful to focus on for improvement. Let's look at those. E3 is unchallenging, nothing really there. Bishop b4 I don't think helps black a whole lot here. I think basically d6 is I understand wanting to get the bishop out so that you can play d6, but I think knight b4 might be better. Knight b4 is usually pretty superficial, but I don't really think that white has a great response to knight b4 and then d5 threats. Maybe bishop c5, but maybe just d6. Yeah, no, I think knight b4 is a little bit better. D6 is sort of tricky, and then bishop to b4. You know, this basically holds in the development of the dark bishop, but it allows free development of the white bishop, and the white bishop can push the queen back pretty effectively. Um, in terms of other improvements, I like how everything's going here. Black has good center control. B5 I don't have that much of a problem with, and C5 I don't have much of a problem with. Both of these make sense to me. You know, you want to start basically attacking the queen side, or you know, basically you want to make both sides uncomfortable for white to castle on. After the castling, I think you play you play B4, but I think I play F rook B8. Engine is suggesting bishop takes G2 or the other rook to B8. That seems, I mean, those I'm sure are also fine moves, but I would play rook. I would play F rook to B8 and then play B4 and have it be supported and attack with that. And also C5 doesn't really hang the B5 pawn because you can get the B2 pawn back for it. Also, the G2 pawn is hanging, but I don't really fault black for not taking it. Yeah. So you know, where are the improvements? I think we can go through them in sort of a quick list. I would prefer D6 to bishop B4 here, just a general idea. And then make this kingside attack more supported. I like the general concept. I think you attacking on the queen side, even pre-castling queen side, is a good idea. I like C5 and I like B5. The queen is now dislocated on queen A6. But yeah, I would play rook B8 before B4. Would be my main change here. Bishop takes G2 is kind of the G2 pawn is a complicated pawn to take. But I guess I would have more complete development on this queenside attack before inching it forward. Anyways, very interesting game. And then bishop takes H2 is the best tactical response to this this pawn takes C5 threat. Yeah. I mean, that's an idea. So queen takes B4 is potentially, or the idea with B4 is that your opponent's scared to take. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, bishop takes G2 is always a little bit risky. I mean, you're always going to open up the... I don't really think whether the center is open or closed. I don't know how much that matters. If bishop takes G2 is threatening the rook on H1, basically black is good here. Rook E1, E4. Yeah, then bishop takes H2. Overall, I think better for black. You know, going into endgame, it's better for black, and you know, there are a few tactical improvements. Bishop takes H2 is another, but I hope this gives a good framework for how to kind of evaluate this position. I would just have made the main strategic point. You know, these tactical points or whatever, but the main strategic point is I would have the rooks on B8 before I would start pushing the B pawns. That I think is better for black. But yeah, up to you. Very interesting game. Thank you very much for sending it, Fachubio. Please keep sending games. I'd like to see them. They're interesting. And yeah, no, I really appreciate it. You know, engine analysis too is always very important. You know, if you can get good engine analysis in, that kind of makes the focus less on you know, less on small tactics and bigger on big ideas. I can't add too much value to where the engine analysis comes in and dominates the analysis, but the strategic stuff is where I'm the most helpful. I would advance the strategy on. I would basically advance the strategy of attacking on the queen side with more piece support. The the rook on the F file was not supporting the B5 B4 push, and I think it might have been helpful to black to get the rook to B8 before the B4 or before the B5 B4 push, or at least before the B4 push. C5 I thought was interesting, and it definitely did give black good center control, but yeah, overall a very interesting game, and thank you very much for sending it, Chubio. Appreciate it. Cool. So this one is the French, and Kathleen is playing black. Kathleen's playing basically, or sorry, the Caro-Kann, and here Bishop challenges immediately with d3. In terms of, yeah, no, appreciate it, Fachubio. Thank you very much for spending the time on it, and yeah, no, hope it's at least a little bit helpful. It's always, but yeah, interesting game. Good counterplay as black against an basically awkwardly placed king. Yeah. Cool. So what are White's responses here? This is a very common Caro-Kann advanced variation position. This happens all the time. Ideas most common: knight f3, h4, which sets up g4. Knight c3. So knight f3, h4, g3, knight d2, bishop e3, c4. And just basically a lot of different moves are playable for White, depending on where White wants to take it. Most aggressive are things like g4 and h4. So here, White challenges immediately with bishop to d3. I think that here probably, there's a few different options. e6 is an option that is interesting. Here I guess I would play bishop takes d3. It's basically, this is a trade that happens a lot in the mainline Caro-Kann. Queen retakes and the bishops are traded off. You've basically traded your weak squared bishop for White's strong squared bishop. So overall, strong, good ideas. I play e6, knight d7, c5 here. I think overall that's a good idea. So e6, knight e2, sure. But you basically traded off your bad squared bishop for White's good squared bishop, and now you can develop your bishop to like b4, and you have a strong diagonal for your bishop. One of the main common issues in the French is that the bishop is, the light squared bishop for black is trapped on c8. With this, you've traded it for the d3 bishop. So this is basically similar to the French, but with better general play. Okay. So ideas like knight f3, queen a5, c3, queen a6. Queen a6 is surprising to me. I'm surprised that this is a main line, but overall, I guess I like this general concept. Queen a5 looks good, queen b6 looks good, c5 looks good to me. But black should basically just try to develop and play this sort of like like a common French opening. Knight e7, knight g6, bishop e7, something like that. c5, pawn takes, rook c8. And basically, I think black's good here. In terms of things that are going on for black versus white, black basically has a good rook, a good outpost for this knight on f5. g4 is probably a pretty unlikely challenge. Knight g6 looks like an appealing possibility, and black's going to be able to castle successfully on the king side. Overall, I think black's position is solid. It shows a small plus for black, and I basically agree with this. In terms of better steps for black here, I think trading off the bishops was correct. You've equalized here. c5 makes sense. Knight e7 makes sense. Pawn takes. Rook c8 is good. Definitely seizing this file is good. This all looks right. Wow, and then it ends. He just hangs the rook. Okay, cool. Overall, not too much in terms of things to improve for black, but I'll slow this down a little bit. Where should black play here? Bishop f5 is the main line. Bishop d3 is a weird move. Doesn't fit into most of the most common opening themes. This is this basically is a good structure, especially if the white squared bishop's no longer an issue. So I think it's strong to recognize that. Here, ideas like knight e7, knight g6, bishop e7 are going to be all strong for black. Castles, c5, reasonable push. I wouldn't play c takes d4 here. This is probably the only move that I think is kind of not that solid. I would probably try to play something along the lines of knight g6 or knight f5. Continue your development. You have the dark squared bishop available. What do I think of black playing c5 instead of bishop f5? That's basically a French that transposes into like a standard French Caro-Kann type position. So c5 here, I don't know what they call it anymore. It basically turns into the French without e6. It's some type of French line, but c5. I don't know. I've seen this opening. I know this opening, but basically it seems like there's some issues with basically you've moved the c pawn twice in this opening. I don't know if that's bad. I know objectively it's not too terrible for black, but like moving your pawn to c6 just to move it to c5 is a big branch in opening theory. But it basically doesn't seem like it's a I dislike it from a fundamental perspective just because you're moving the same pawn twice before you've developed any pieces. I know it's playable. I know there's lines here, but that would be sort of a deterrent for me. C3 basically e4 e5 is also a relatively unhelpful pawn push. You're right. But it's just responded too well with c3. I mean, basically, the concept of maintaining d4 and e5 in the French is not that is basically not that. I mean, d4 e5 in the French is sort of the defining feature of that position, whether white's able to maintain it or not. Basically playing c5 and having it responded to with c3 comfortably seems unchallenging from black. Basically you're getting you're gonna end up with black unable to successfully use the c5 push to undermine d4. The c pawn can just retake. So that's why I would say that probably c takes d4 and then c takes d4 leads to a relatively good position for white. White basically undermining in the French is important, and this c takes d4, c takes d4 leads to a position where black no longer has the resource c5 to push on d4 with. So for that reason, and sort of some similarities to the actual game, I guess I would say leave c takes d4 off the list. Play something like knight c6, knight a5, f6 even. Hey, good morning, Anch. Thank you guys very much for joining the stream. Thanks all for being here. But yeah, I would take a look at c5. I would take a look at holding on to c5 because if it can be responded to comfortably with c takes d4, it's not really much of a benefit. The main idea in the French here, which this now is in many respects. Yeah, no, of course. Thank you very much for sending the game, Kathleen, and I'm super happy to help with that. Thanks. Thank you for contributing material for the stream. But yeah, so I would say c5, c takes d4 is. I think c takes d4 is conceptually not as good as just maintaining the tension. I'd keep pushing things along the lines of like knight g6, knight f5, knight c6. Rook c8 probably is actually the clearest improvement of a piece here. Rook c8 is the one that moves development forward in the most unambiguous way, taking this half-open file. But c takes d4 at this point, I think just it sort of wastes a resource for black. This resource c takes d4 is kind of this is a valuable thing for black in the French, trying to disrupt the d4 pawn. If you play rook c8, d takes c5 diminishes that center that I was talking about as being like maintaining the main point of the French. But rook c8 is, I think, an improvement here. It's a very unambiguously improving move. C takes d4, I think, is not. It's unclear what the value of that is. I mean, maybe knight c6, then knight b4, but I don't think black benefits at all from relieving this tension between c5 and d4. I think it's basically pretty good for black. So I'd play rook c8 here. C takes d4, okay. But overall, I think it's really just an accurate game. Well played, not a ton of improvements. h3 is an error, allowing knight f4. And then this good fork, knight e2 forking the king on g1 and c1. Looks solid to me. But yeah, I think overall, Kathleen, very solid game. I mean, it was a relatively short game, so it didn't have many opportunities for black improvement. But here, I guess I would say this is the only move in the entire game that I think that the intuition is something to consider. You know, relieving the tension, c takes d4, c takes d4 is probably not that great for black. Rook c8 pushing onto the open file is very clearly good for black. So that I would play the unambiguously good move as opposed to the somewhat less clear c takes d4. I don't think c takes d4 really advances white's or black's position in any way. Maybe something along the lines of like knight c6, knight b4 could be one of the reasons that d4 is good, but I would just play rook c8 and capture the semi-open file. Looks good, solid. Makes sense to me at least. So otherwise, great game. I think you didn't make any other errors, so I'm sort of nitpicking on this one. Solid, well played game. Yeah, no, I think that's a good idea, Kathleen. I think basically this, you know, I think c takes d4, you know, is one c5. The c5 push is a key part of undermining the d4 e5 structure, but I would keep that resource until later, maybe. But this is the key part of the French, whether or not white can keep on the d4 and e5 pawns. But yeah, I think that's a good idea. Keep holding on to those pawns, and overall that will work out for you very well as black. Hey, thank you very much for the follow, Dopey. I appreciate it. Thank you for joining the stream. So yeah, c takes d4 is an idea, but rook c8 is more clearly better. Anyways, on to the next game. Thank you very much for sending that, Kathleen. This is Sansejwani's game. Let me just pull it up now. Okay. And it looks like Sansejwani sent a live game that has expired. If Sansejwani is here, he could send a like a recap of the game, but it was sent on a live board, so it's no longer a valid game. I should have probably said something at the time, but it looks like a live game got sent in. So with that in mind, I think we can take a look at one of the things that I was interested in doing last night. I have basically a few more games. If Sansejwani is here and he wants to send in a game that's an analysis status instead of a live game, that I should have caught that, to be honest. I'll keep that one in mind for the next time. But unfortunately, Sansejwani, if it's a live game, I can't recover it after a few days. Yeah, thank you very much for joining the stream, Gimmick. If anyone's interested, I have my own Discord. You know, there's two Discords that I really like. I have my own Discord, which is a super good place to send. This is my personal Discord for the stream. You can submit on this game submissions part of the channel. There's also the chess study group Discord, which has been nice enough to let me have its own aspect of the channel there. This is the chess study group. Either of them will work. You know, I guess I have a little bit of bias towards the Discord that specifically services this stream. But the chess study group Discord has also been helpful in terms of a place to add games for me to take a look at. So chess study group. So this is just this info here. Either feel free to submit on mine or feel free to submit on the chess study group Discord. They're both great places, and feel free to send whatever you like. You know, at this point, we take things, suggestions, and then they don't have to be games either. They can be either chess games that you submit, or generally, you know, general ideas. So what I was going to go through too, since if Sansejwani is here and he can send an analysis game, please do. I should have caught that it was a live game when you sent it. But we'll talk after this stream if you don't send one before this ends. But yeah, Overall, I also want to move into basically more general ideas. I have two suggestions. I have e4, c5, f4, which is basically the Grand Prix game, and I have the Vienna Gambit, and I wanted to look at both of those in the rest of the stream. I also want to look at Sansachwani's game, but if not, we'll cover this. We'll cover his game tomorrow probably, or tonight potentially if I can correspond with him before then. But yeah, let's look. E4, C5, F4. This is an opening Grand Prix attack without F3, or without Knight C3. So let's take a look. Cool. E4, C5, F4. In terms of responses to the Sicilian, F4 is number 7. It looks like. Knight c3 is much more common, also involves, the Grand Prix attack, which is one of the most common lines in the Grand Prix Sicilian. But this is a different approach. This is basically white seizing the e5 square almost immediately. So e4, c4, e4, f4, and c5, and white is controlling the e5 square right off the bat. d5, I think, is the most common response. In general, push that push that black struggles to play in the Sicilian can often be d5, basically challenging in the center. It's the e4 for white counteracts the d5 for black. So if black can safely play d5 against e4, that can basically be pretty good for that trade generally tends to be good for black because it neutralizes the central pawn that white has already established in response with d5. And neutralizing these two is a reasonable idea. Then, this c5 has control over d4, and control over the center is a little bit more ambiguous. So d5, I think, is the best solution to this. I was going to look at other lines in the Sicilian and just see how common d5 was as a response. Knight f3, d5 is not commonly played because d5, pawn takes d5, queen takes d5, knight c3, and white gets to threaten the queen with development. Other lines in which white can't immediately recapture d5. Here, one is c3 can be responded to with d5 in the Alpen. This basically leads to this potential trade, which will be good for black. White can't successfully challenge the queen, so both sides, it frees up the ability to develop the light squared bishop, and it basically leads to healthy development for black. Hey, what's up, FIFA boy? Welcome to the stream. So here d5, pawn takes d5, queen takes d5. This is pretty good for black versus white. Other options, other cases in which black plays d5, g3 can be responded to by d5 pretty successfully. Here, queen takes d5 and knight c3 isn't playable because of queen takes h1. That's really bad. But yeah, f4 is another place where d5 can comfortably be played. d5, e takes d5, queen takes d5, knight c3. This is the main line. Black chooses generally between, in this situation where it's the Sicilian, black's choosing between d6 and d8. They're both, reasonable ways, and sort of transposes into some kind of weird line of the Scandinavian where the f4 pawn is there. But yeah, I want to just look at the main lines here. So let's go through a few of them. It's an interesting opening. It basically makes white's pressure on e4 and basically strengthens white's center. The reason why this usually comes after knight to c3 as opposed to being played immediately is because of this threat on d5. So ideas for black: d5, knight c6, e6, g6, d6. Those are all options. The most immediately challenging is d5, and that's the main line. But other things also challenge here. So, I guess knight f6 threatens the e4 pawn. I think d5, to be honest, is a pretty overwhelming favorite. Also, knight to c6 is good because it will be, holding the d4 square, which is a common, place where there's conflict in the Sicilian. But I think d5 is probably just d5 immediately is probably the best play for black. Challenge the center, allow knight c3, and then play it like a Scandinavian game with c5 placement and f4 placement. That makes the most sense. So I don't know. There are other lines here. E6 and knight c3 transposes it back into a Grand Prix attack. Knight f3 makes a lot of sense here, although it allows d5 again. Knight f3 is good. One of the main advantages of the closed Sicilian with the Grand Prix attack and also of this opening is you can play the knight behind the f4 pawn. One of the main issues in the Sicilian is basically developing or the closed Sicilian at least, is how to develop the knight without blocking the f4 pawn. That's a tough question. Basically knight e2, knight c3, f4 is an idea, g3, bishop g2. That's the kind of structure that you can go for as white against the Sicilian. But I would go for like d3. I don't know. Bishop c4 isn't playable until e5 has been played usually in the Sicilian. G3 you can try, develop the bishop to g2, then knight e2, then f4. That's probably the most common Grand Prix structure. But yeah, f4 is an interesting move. In terms of analysis, I think it's going to frequently transpose into, something that looks like the regular Sicilian. I'm seeing if there's an immediate thing that leads to black's advantage here. Let's look at the d5 line. I guess that's the one that I'm the most curious about. But this still looks good for black relative to white. I think in terms of refuting this, I don't think black can successfully do that. But I do think that it's usually a transpositional tool, and kind of not the clearest way to advance this. Maybe knight c3 is the next move for white, but I'm kind of curious. e6. I don't know if this on knight f3. I guess black gets this d5 in. The primary issue with this is black's d5, and this is going to be true in a lot of different Sicilian variations. Knight f3, knights develop, then maybe d4. Nah, I guess that hangs a pawn. That hangs the d4 pawn. Maybe transpose it into the King's Indian attack. That could be interesting. But this is definitely going to transpose into a closed Sicilian. I'm going to look for a line that transposes this into an open Sicilian, and I probably am not going to be able to find one. Let's see. So d5 is by far the most commonly played here. Knight c6. Then can you play d4 at all? Probably not. C takes, knight f6. And basically the inability to play bishop d3 here is a big liability for white. Maybe knight takes c6, maybe knight c3, queen d3 looks sort of interesting. But basically, if white tries to transpose this into an open Sicilian, I think white's going to encounter some problems here. It's just tricky. It's difficult to figure out exactly how to do this as white. D4, D4 is probably just not going to be playable. Black's going to jump on it too quickly with something like knight c6 or d5. If black plays a more passive response, so say a6, then I wonder if you can play d4. I don't know. No, still leaning towards unplayable after d5. It's really interesting. I mean, it's basically, you're committing to a closed Sicilian without playing knight c3, and you're also leaving vulnerabilities up to d5. So overall, I guess I would say, as a takeaway from this this general idea, knight c3 is probably better than knight c3 f4 is probably better than e4 f4. In terms of strengthening, in terms of evaluating the opening. I don't see much purpose for e4, f4 immediately. It seems to create problems without giving much in the way of solutions. Like, e5 is the move that f4 most effectively refutes, and e4 is not really a threat here. So, with e5, bishop c4, and you're capitalizing on the e5 pawn having been played. So I guess, you know, the reason why I would steer you away from f4 is not because it's inherently too terrible, but mostly because it doesn't accomplish anything that knight c3 f4 doesn't already accomplish. e5 is just not a threat. G5 is not a threat. Knight c6, knight e5 is not a threat, and you would have solved that anyways with the grand pre-move order. So I guess it's just the lack of solutions that f4 provides that would steer me away from that opening. It does provide some you know, some compensation practically. It's a weird looking opening. It's interesting, but knight c3 f4 is how I suggest that you play it. You're gonna end up playing knight c3 in the e4 f4 variation anyways, so you might as well just do that. You know, I have kind of an interesting take on these, which is that I do actually think you can get I think you can get into a situation where you're you get practical compensation, and that's valuable. Putting your opponent in a situation where they don't have a book response has some value, less and less as you get to a higher level, but you know, it is an opening that where your opponent will say, how do I play this? And there is some value in putting them into that situation and making them just play chess in a situation that they're unfamiliar with. You know, my goal is, you know, my suggestion in terms of improving at chess is get to the point where you can successfully say that you're better at playing chess. You know, and I use playing chess as generally like the idea of beating your opponent on positional and tactical concepts in a regular, you know, in an unknown position, a position where you're in the middle game. And that's really where you want to win. So if you play something unorthodox but not inferior, you can start the concept of playing chess sooner. You know, basically leaving the game up not to preparation but to actual positional and tactical concepts. That's why I would say that's valuable. So yeah, overall, interesting e4, f4 opening, but I'm not particularly impressed or convinced of its value beyond the general Grand Prix attack. All right, I also wanted to look at the Vienna Gambit during this lesson. The Vienna Gambit's pretty similar to the King's Gambit, and let's take a look at that. So here I'll open up a new analysis board. This e4, e5, knight c3, either knight c6, f4, is the Vienna Gambit. So, you know, what are the we've gone over this to some degree before, and my understanding, and I'm yet to see kind of a refutation of it, is basically that you know, accepting the gambit is yeah, so accepting the gambit here, and actually, sorry, I just want to look at one other opening too. So e4, e5, knight c3, knight f6, f4. And here, basically, this is not the Vienna Gambit. This is, this is the Falkbeer Gambit. So let's just differentiate between these two. This is the Vienna game Falkbeer Gambit, and d5 is so that's sort of where I was going with this. d5 is forced, you know, on knight f6, f4. d4 is objectively the only move here that leads to Falkbeer, is the name of it. But basically, this gambit is better for white, except for one variation. So any other analysis here, there's really like an almost 1 point difference between d5 and every other response. So in this case, d5 is the only line that puts black ahead. If black plays d5, he's in good shape. If black plays anything besides d5, he's basically in an inferior position after knight f3. So I'd say like knight c6, and then either knight f3 or pawn takes e5. But or I guess knight c6, pawn takes e5. Knight c6 is not the most common response, I don't think. f4, d5 is overwhelmingly the best. On d6, you play knight f3, white's better. On knight c6, you play pawn takes e5, white is better. Knight takes e5 and d4. White's better here by like 1.6, a lot. So d5 is the forced move for black here. Those are the top three. We can go through another one. Pawn takes f3, e5. This challenges the knight most efficiently, but good for white against black. Yeah, so I'd say e5 here. The knight gets forced to somewhere unusual. But I just wanted to differentiate between those two openings. Knight c3, knight c6, and then here, knight f3 is an idea. There's a few different, there's a few different ways to play it. But the Vienna Gambit in this is the max length Vienna Gambit. Important to differentiate between those two. Overall, I think this is not so great. It's basically a King's Gambit where the knight has not, basically where an unproductive move has been played on move 3. So, if in terms of evaluating this game, e5, f4, pawn takes f4, knight c3, knight c6, you would say, oh, this is very clearly good for black. And it is. Instead, knight c3, knight c6, f4, pawn takes f4, somehow it becomes more ambiguous if you play under this move order. But it's exactly the same position. You would just say, oh, this is a King's Gambit, if you go this way, you say, oh, this is a King's Gambit where white played an inefficient move. But if you go the other way, e4, e5, knight c3, knight c6, f4, pawn takes, then you would say, okay, well, this is something else that I don't recognize. But it's an identical position, and these types of things happen in chess. It sort of matters how you get to where you get to. It's kind of funny. But this overall pawn takes f4 this is generally just not that strong for white. When you said Vienna Gambit, I assume you were looking at this one. We've already looked at the other one. The other one's refuted by d5. But generally here, white's just worse. It's a King's Gambit with an inefficient knight c3 move played. We can go through it. I don't know how helpful that's going to be. Basically here, knight f3, g5, h4, g4, knight g5, h6. Yeah, overall here, this is just not that great for white, to be honest. This is a full sacrifice. Black's going to be way ahead. 1.3, pretty bad. So yeah, I want to differentiate. I want to spend a lot of time kind of defining these two, and saying that this one is clearly worse for white. The other one, knight c3, knight f6, f4, is only worse for white after d5. This one makes a lot of sense. A lot of people here don't play d5. A lot of people here don't really know this one. So you have pretty good chances to get ahead as white, based on the idea that black doesn't play d5. The other way, knight c3, knight f6, f4, this is pretty unambiguously bad for white. It's an inefficient King's Gambit. Maybe d4, maybe knight f3, maybe bishop c4. Say knight f3 here, g5, h4, g6, g4. This is just, it's just not good. There's probably, this is the most conservative, or this is the most aggressive way that black can play it with these g-pawn pushes. Otherwise, if you look at like d6, d4, g5, but one of the advantages is black can quickly play g5. Yeah, no, totally. I think, yeah, the knight gets stuck over there and loses, so meh, whatever. f4, pawn takes f4, and you've played an inefficient King's Gambit. So I wouldn't recommend this Vienna Gambit. The other Vienna Gambit's the one that I think is more interesting. So if you're playing into the Vienna Gambit, be ready to do something else. Yeah. No, I like this. So f4, d5, f takes e5, knight takes e4, queen f3. Okay, cool. Yeah, no, we're gonna get to your game in 1 second, Electric Horse. Yeah, no, you're next, and we'll wrap up the stream with yours, Electric. Thank you very much for joining and for sending the game. But yeah, this gambit I think is overall better for white. These lines I think are overall better for white. From an eval perspective, this is a little worse, but I think gimmick. This is probably the best idea of white to improve his situation. I like it. I think in general, this is a very playable game for white against black's best response, which he's not going to play often. At master level, sure, masters know to play d5 here. But in general, I think you'll see a lot of games where d5 isn't played, and every variation of this opening in which d5 is not played is better for white. This is the eval set. Plus 0.6 after everything except for d5. So I wouldn't talk you out of playing this one. And basically, with Vienna being played, knight c6 f4 is pretty clearly bad for white. Knight f6 with f4 is only bad for white in the case that black plays d5, which he often doesn't. So overall, I think this is pretty good. This, I don't know what the best lines are. But if black plays knight c6, I think you're best off playing like knight f3 and just playing a Vienna game as opposed to Vienna gambit. 3 knights opening, Vienna game, 4 knights opening probably turns into. But yeah, either knight f3 or bishop c4, probably bishop c4, and then you have those like queen g4 lines that are kind of cool. But be prepared to play something other than f4 if black plays knight c6 to your knight c3. Yeah, exactly. You might as well play this instead of knight c3, knight c6. So here, on knight c6, be prepared to play something other than f4. F4 is just unambiguously bad. I mean, it's just basically unambiguously a worse line of the king's gambit. So I wouldn't play that here. I'd play like queen g, bishop c4, bishop c5, queen g4, knight f3 transposes into the 3 knights game. G3 is probably kind of interesting. I don't really know that one super well, but it looks kind of cool. And overall here, I think white's in a pretty good general place. Okay, I wanted to move on to the last game of this morning. It's going to be the game for eccentric course, electric course, and we'll take a look at it. Awesome. But yeah, thank you very much for that. And Sansajwani, please resend the game. I should have caught it. I feel bad. But please send the game not in live mode, but in analysis mode, so I can retrieve it from chess.com. In live mode, those links just expire, and 2 days is enough, I guess, for it to expire. I'm learning all sorts of kind of small tricks here, but that's the recommendation I would make on that one. Sorry about that. We'll talk after the stream. But yeah. On to the last one. Last one is eccentric courses game, and we will take a look. Okay, eccentric course is playing black, and he's facing a very early e3 out of the queen's pawn game. Okay, so e3 out of the queen's pawn game is interesting. I guess I would say here, what would you do? Like, E3 is kind of an interesting, I guess, you have many options actually as white, but E3 is not a preferred one. E3 is like well down the list. Queen's Gambit obviously is the most popular. Knight F3 can be played. Bishop F4 is the London system. But E3, I don't even know. To be honest, I don't think this has a name. I don't know the name of it. D5, E3. So what do you do here when white plays something that's less challenging? I think the most straightforward thing to do is just play standard developing moves. You might have some ideas with c5 here. C5 is sort of the inverse of the Queen's Gambit. Queen's Gambit declined. On c5, on pawn takes c5, you can play Queen a5. But it's overall an unchallenging. It's an unchallenging way for white to play against black. There's many better threats that white has in terms of turning this into a an attacking game. White's pushing for initiative, and this diminishes his initiative. So here, knight f6, I'm sure is fine. Knight c6, probably not as good because it blocks in the c pawn. But the engine is also, by the way, suggesting c5. So any one of these ideas, I think, is okay. But knight f6 is the most common, so we'll go with that. c4 transposes into a Queen's Gambit declined, in which there's still, although you can accept it here, it transposes into a Queen's Gambit where things are pretty, generally pretty weak for black, weak for white. It's just very passive. E3 is passive. It can be used transpositionally, but you're still going to be dragging, you're basically going to be dragging out for a while until this becomes a recognizable transposition. it may transpose, with standard development. But among other things, it locks in White's dark squared bishop, which also sometimes happens in queen's pawn games. But overall, I just think it's passive and it causes some problems. C6, knight f3, e6, c5. So here, c5 is an error for White. This makes sense. You've transposed it into a semi-Slav position. Still with an early e3 for White, but now it's recognizably like the semi-Slav. I would play, I would play probably as White, but as both sides here, really, just standard developing moves. It's a semi-Slav now. C5 is a really aggressive way to play this. And the issue is, I think it's just too easily undermined. I'm going to take a look at where the analysis shifts here, but I bet it's pretty significant. It's almost a pawn. C5 is an interesting idea. Bishop d6 is probably is realistically probably a move. I think the semi-Slav is a really good solid opening. I play the Grunfeld myself, so I know the Grunfeld concepts better than I know the semi-Slav concepts. The semi-Slav, usually involves a push on e5 and slow development of, general liability and slow development of the bishop on c8. But the semi-Slav, I think, is a pretty good opening. I like it, and you can work with it for sure. C5 is just too. It creates too many problems for White relative to the problems that it creates for Black. Bishop d6 probably is a move that Black wants to play in this game to hold the e5 square, but c5 is really, it really releases the tension in the center to achieve that goal of having Black not play d6 or bishop d6. Something like straightforward developing moves like knight c3, bishop d3, bishop d2, probably bishop e2 are all way more just generally good than c5. I would play b6 here. This undermines this center structure. Black may follow up with b4, and then with b4 you play, and it's almost a bit accepted in reverse. A5 is good. Threatens this b4 pawn. Threatens the pin on the rook on a1, and generally I just think this is solid. Black is in a good place here. Queen a4 gets played, so a takes b4 isn't possible, but then in that line you play bishop b7, and then you have all the threats back on the next one. Then they can play a3, right? So here, but basically as this continues to develop, this gets worse and worse for White. Here I think you might be able to play, I don't know, can you play pawn takes? I mean, this really gets very uncomfortable for White. You've now fractured the kingside pawn structure, and bn d7 looks good for Black. So you can transpose to something that looks like the Queen's Gambit accepted, but in the Queen's Gambit accepted, usually the position gets worse and worse as you continue to try to defend, and then you end up not being able to defend anyways, and it's just kind of worse for White here. So b6 is what I play for Black, and I think White's best option is probably just to take it here and allow the undermining. Other options, b4 is going to wind up with that huge tangle over here. A5, we can play it to the end. I mean, we'll see the end, but bishop d2, pawn takes, queen takes, bn d7 or something. But this is generally pretty good for Black, I think. It's just a lot of pressure still being placed on this c5 pawn. I would play b6 with the immediate undermining in mind. It's just an overextension for White. White can't really comfortably play c5 this early, and it relieves the tension in the center. Now you have this pawn structure, or at the very least this pawn structure without the b7 pawn, cemented for Black, and it's a good pawn structure to have. So I would say b6 over bishop b7. Bishop b7 is still fine. This is still a good pawn structure to have. But it doesn't have quite the same, it doesn't press White quite as quickly as a b6 does. But Black is still winning. Engine is suggesting a5. Knight d7, queen c7 I would play. You want to get this e5 push, I think, and basically trade off your inferior e6 pawn for White's superior d4 pawn. I think that's probably pretty good. You eventually get the e5 push. I don't know if it likes it. Yeah, it likes it. Okay, cool. So yeah, yeah. White ends up with this huge pawn structure, but it's too easily undermined is the issue. A5 and b6, and the pawn structure sort of crashes. I like the e5. I'm kind of wondering where this slips away. I think black does slightly better from an objective standpoint if he challenges immediately. B6 and A5 are really good to be playing here. But knight D7 is good, and general pressure on the white pawn structures is good. But here, yeah, I mean black is looking fine. I'd play knight c4 here. Yeah, okay, cool. So now, yeah, black's secured the advantage. This pawn structure for black is definitely better than the pawn structure for white. Like very clearly, like this is much better than that. And the knight c4 is a great outpost. It's going to take a while for white to fix this, and it's going to probably come at the cost of trading off his good squared bishop. I like it. Yeah, black's looking real solid here, and has the bishop pair, and pawn structures are pretty similar, but the bishop pair could be very valuable. King's probably also a little bit easier to get active. Oh, and here I'd play bishop to d3. Or, sorry, yeah, f6, and then bishop to d3. They're saying f5 is best, but, well, I don't know. This is kind of interesting. It's an interesting question in this endgame whether black should trade off his white squared bishop for the knight. Because it does definitely immediately win him a pawn, right? It wins him the b4 pawn, and a better pawn structure. But I don't know if white should be ready to play bishop takes d3, bishop takes b4. That's a tricky question. This is great. Yeah, this is exactly what white or what black wants to happen, though. Want to play out this endgame. It's probably, yeah, it's a draw by now. This ends up trading into an opposite colored bishop endgame where one pawn is not enough. But where should black play this differently? I like this position for black. I think a lot of this comes from, I think maybe a more solid plan comes. Hey, welcome Adriana. Thank you very much for joining the stream. I would play king e7. I'd get the king in there. Things like f6, king f7, king e6, and then moving the king into the black territory. I think in this general plan, black was really held back a lot by the inactivity of his king. You only have 3 pieces to work with, and yeah, no, for sure, and it's very difficult to convert. I mean, it's going to end up being a difficult pawn, basically difficult conversion. These minor piece endgames are difficult. But I have to think that, I mean, maybe the error here, I guess I would say the biggest error probably is in trading off into the minor piece endgame. Here with the queens on the board, your drawing chances, your queens and the rooks on the board, your drawing chances are a lot lower. I think black should try to trade off less aggressively here. Involve a lot of pieces. You've got a relatively open position. And great minor pieces at this point. So I think maybe the error is in trading off. You have a slight positional advantage, not a material advantage, but you definitely have the initiative and you have the attack. So I'm going to sort of lean on the default. If you're attacking, don't trade off pieces because you need the pieces to attack your opponent with. And by the way, this knight d2 wins an exchange. So I want to make sure that we take a look at. I mean, this obviously is a tactical improvement. That's just an attention issue. This queen and this rook. So that would have probably pushed you pretty close to a win. But in general, I wouldn't trade off pieces as freely as you did. Trading this knight for this bishop is a little bit ambiguous in terms of relative value. Yeah, knight to d2 is basically pretty good. It forks the queen and rook, and I think puts black in a relatively good position. I think your general concept of trading the knight off for a bishop is good. Obviously, this is a tactical improvement. Trading your knight off for a rook is even better. But yeah, this was not the right move at the right time. Knight d2 was the better play. Black's looking fine, but this whole trading, this whole large trading concept, I think, is not a good idea. Yeah, no, for sure. For sure, and I understand it. And, bishop pair going into endgame versus non-bishop pair going into endgame, it makes sense. But so first, the tactical improvement, which I won't harp on anymore because it's, this is clear. But I think here, as a general concept, trading off pieces are not that great. Also, I'd probably wait until this knight is getting threatened by like white's light squared bishop to trade it off. I just leave it there. This is just such a strong outpost for the knight that I would probably just keep it in a pretty good place and then just leave it there. No issues. This discovery was pretty good. But here I think your winning chances might go down if you trade off so much. Queen takes d7 looks inaccurate. Bishop takes. I don't know. Your winning chances. I mean, the eval does go in your direction after you trade off everything, but it's just tricky to win this one. Let's look at this line. Bishop c3, b5. Sure, this is good for black, but I don't think white has to play it in exactly this way. So yeah, in terms of walking away from this game, where are the improvements? The end game is very complicated. I don't want to necessarily look at, I think there are more obvious things. I mean, the end game, yeah, you could probably calculate on. I recommend computer analysis to solve that end game for sure. Here, b6 looks good. I think getting an earlier compromise of this c5 pawn is a good idea. b6 is what I would play. Definitely a good way to go about it. b6, a5. I like how all this went. Knight seizing the powerful c4 pawn is good. But yeah, I would try to turn this position here. I would try to turn it after c5. I would try to turn it into like a favorable Queen's Gambit exchange, or sorry, Queen's Gambit accepted. Fracture things with b6, pawn takes c5, pawn takes c5. If b4, a5, and make white basically have to expend tons of resources in order to defend this thing. That would be my advice for a strategic improvement there. The second one is obviously this knight d7 being available, knight d2 move here being available is a good thing for black. That wins an exchange and will probably win the game if you win an exchange. That wouldn't surprise me at all. And then here you have two bishops to a knight and a bishop, and it's pretty close to equal. But sort of difficult to muscle out. In this endgame position, which is it's very complicated. It's a complicated thing to look at in a minute or two. I would activate the king. Having seen this endgame, I would activate the king quicker in a general sense. The king sits on g8 and the bishops do all this stuff, but then they can't really successfully advance the pawn because the king's not there. I'd be really cautious about trading off this for this knight into an opposite colored bishop endgame. This is extremely likely to be drawn. But in general, I would say, come up with. I would use an engine for the advanced analysis of this one. I don't think I can do it justice in a minute. Um, what's the refutation here? Bishop d6. So say king e3, and let's play out this line. Yeah, this line quickly equalizes. It's just a tough game to win as black. I think probably trading off decreased your winning chances, and overall, yeah, maybe, maybe. I mean, the worst case scenario, you trade into a bishop endgame and draw though. I think taking all the queens and rooks off made your drawing chances go up, even if the engine is giving you a more favorable eval. Yeah, no, for sure. I think you're I think you're right. But I think basically once you traded off the queen and the rook, your winning chances went down a lot, and that wasn't particularly helpful to you. So overall, I think it's a very interesting game. We saw a few tactical improvements and definitely a positional improvement relating to c5. The endgame's very complicated. I think black's evals are probably a little bit generous at the very beginning of it. I think it becomes much more likely to draw after you trade off the queens and rooks. I would probably have been less... I would have been less likely to do that. You had a positional advantage. I probably would have left the knight on the c4 square because that was a pretty good outpost. And overall, no, they did, but you were up. You were winning. You had a positional advantage there. I don't know. It was probably a draw from the... I mean, it was... the eval is minus 1.7 after the queens and rooks are trade-off. An advantage for black. That seems unrealistically high. So I would have left the queens and rooks on and capitalized on your positional advantage. I probably wouldn't have traded the knight for the b2 bishop. But overall, very complicated endgame with two bishops against the bishop and knight. Very interesting stuff. Yeah, thank you very much for sending that, Electric. We looked at that place where you can win an exchange. That's kind of the lazy way. You can kind of point to that exchange there and be like, yeah, that would have won for black, and probably would have. But I think even after that, your drawing chances went up a lot after trading off the queens and rooks. If you wanted to win, I probably would have kept those on the board. Interesting game. And more threats on that c5 pawn with b6. Usually white will end up getting unreal. Usually black and queen's gambit accepted, or white in this case, will get unreasonably tangled by trying to maintain the c5 pawn. But yeah, I think overall, Electric, a good, strong game, well played. And thank you very much for sending it. Please keep sending games. Very happy to see them. Super interesting to look at. And thank you very much. Thank you for joining the stream, and appreciate you being here. My next stream is at 6:05 p.m. Eastern today, and I look forward to seeing you there. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for sending the game, Electric. Please keep sending them. Very happy to do the analysis. Thanks a lot. Have a good day, everyone. Goodbye. Thanks.